Commissioner Lemke,
Here.
Commissioner Stoker,
Here.
Commissioner Parrish,
Here.
Mayor Worth.
Here, we have a quorum. The first item on the agenda tonight is the approval of the minutes from September 9th. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion, corrections? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
The next item is the consent agenda, but before we actually get into the consent agenda, we need a motion to remove item 2A from the table.
So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Now we need a motion on the consent agenda.
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Does anybody want to remove anything from the consent agenda? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
The consent agenda is approved. The first item of regular business is Jim Hoffman for Pine Reserve LLC. Mr. Hoffman, or whoever would like to, if you want to approach the table and introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Jim Hoffman.
That works. Staff, is there something you'd like to say?
Sure. This is a rather perfunctory item, but there is one issue that we need to address with the commission. This is a certified survey map for 4 lots over on River Birch Drive. This was in front of you earlier this year for the rezoning to switch the zoning from R6 for the side-by-sides to the R5 for the single family. The CSM shows that all lots are compliant with the R5 zoning standards. There is one issue that Bridget can address with regard to a wetland setback, and I'll turn it over to her and I'll put you the wetland exhibit up on the screen.
For, once it's on the screen, lots 1 and lot 2 have a significant amount of wetlands on the lots, and I'll speak to lot 1 first. So lot 1 not only has setbacks on its northern property boundary for wetlands, but it also has, and of course it's not shown on this particular map, but there's also a building setback on the north side and a building setback on the east side that wouldn't allow the buildings to be built in that area. So both the wetland setback and the building setbacks overlap. So we're looking at doing a 30-foot setback for the wetlands in that area, which would not reduce the buildable area on the north and the east side. On the northeast side, where that triangle of wetlands juts out into the lot, that does make the lot virtually unbuildable for the applicant. They would like to reduce that area to a 10-foot no-mow buffer to provide for buildability of that lot. The original Concord Creek subdivision had 30-foot setbacks throughout this area, so this would be a change to reduce that wetland setback for the applicant.
And staff does not oppose that change, is that correct?
That is correct. Lot 2 has, does not have the same restrictions as Lot 1. There isn't as much of a setback on that east property boundary. So the 30-foot wetland setback would encroach into Lot 2, and staff would support keeping that at a 30-foot wetland setback.
Would you like to add anything?
We have worked extensively with the homeowners of the condominiums immediately adjacent to this property, and we have beefed up the restrictions to try to make the minimum architectural requirements such that the houses will be substantial enough to not devalue the high-end condos that are around them. Everybody realizes this isn't the best land in Mequon, but it's also nice land. It's good land. Part of the discussion with the existing homeowners is trying to then get buyers of these lots to use side entrance garages, not have front entrance garages. And on lot number 2, and I've scaled several different floor plans, there won't be any way with a 30-foot setback from the wetland to require someone to have a side garage. If nothing else, then they might have the garage doors facing the center part of the house, which makes for what I call the sea of asphalt in one's front yard, which is also not attractive. So in trying to come up with a balance here, We would like to have staff have the option if we present them with a good plan. I mean, I don't mind fundamentally a 30-foot setback. I understand where it's coming from. But in this particular case, I don't want it to then drive a house to be less substantial and less attractive than it might be otherwise. I also don't have a problem putting in the restrictions, the no-mow buffer. I don't have a problem with that stuff all being recorded. I know there was a part of staff's comment that said, well, people ignore that stuff. Well, I don't have a problem putting it in, so people get that right at their closing, and it's a recorded document. So somehow I'd like to reach a middle ground if we could on this. And there's also a gentleman from the Homeowners Association from the condominiums here tonight. He'd like to speak to this as well.
Oh, I was going to call him next. Actually,
Okay.
I meant to do it before I turned to you, but I missed the fact this was here. Steve Schaefer from River Birch Drive registered in favor and says he wishes to speak. Mr. Schaefer.
Hi. Good evening. I want to echo Jim's comments. By way of background, I was, I think, Jim's first or last buyer in the condo association about 12 years ago, so we've had the longest longevity in the complex. And over the last 12 years, Jim's been a great developer and kind of been working with us quite a bit, especially the last 3 or 4 years as the economy started recovering, but he still could not build these condo complex out as we originally had planned 12, 13 years when we all bought. I appreciate Jim's position, and I think we all do in speaking to the owners, that these condos are just not feasible to be resold and built to the quality and size they currently are. However, we have been working with Jim for the last couple of, probably 2 or 3 months in earnest, trying to get the property rezoned. And I've met with Jack a couple of times trying to look for guidelines in terms of homeowner associations, how to restructure the property, how to get it redesigned properly. So I do appreciate his support as well. I think our biggest concern, as Jim mentioned, we fully acknowledge that most people want 3-stall garages now. And a 3-stall garage is nominally going to be 35 to 40 feet wide. And we prefer not to have a 3-stall garage facing the street, which is very different than what our condos are. I acknowledge most of our condos, the garages do face the streets. However, it's less than 50% of the frontage due to the layout of the condos. The rest of Concord Creek subdivisions, the garages all face the side lots. And we would like to be consistent with the rest of Concord Creek subdivision. I've looked at the DNR requirements, which I know this is what the village or the city based their requirements on sometime a year ago. It's my understanding that DNR is a 10% setback, subject to a minimum of 10 feet up to a maximum of 30 feet setback. So I'm a little bit confused on what the DNR is requiring, what this versus the city of Mequon requires. So I think by my calculations, the 10% setback would probably fit within the 10-foot Mequon requirements as well, going back, again, 10, 20 years, I think, when this was adopted. So I think what we're requesting on behalf of all of our owners, just reasonable consideration by the board itself or by the committee to try to come up with a fair compromise for Jim, the developer, the owner, ourselves, and the city itself.
Thank you.
So with that, any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you. Discussion with the commissioners. Yes, sir.
Jack, help me understand, on Lot 1, the setback from the wetlands is what? You've agreed to have something less than 30 feet, right?
No.
So per our current ordinance, the setback should be 50 feet.
Okay.
However, when Concord Creek was developed, it was 30 feet at that time, so we would be supportive of going down to 30 feet. The developer would like us to take that even further and go down to 10 feet, no mow buffer, to make these lots buildable.
And your position is?
We're open to it in select locations for the 10-foot no mow buffer, but we wouldn't want to make a blanket across both lots that they could have 10 feet along the entirety of the perimeter. The intent of a wetland setback is to protect the wetlands, and the greater that setback distance is, the greater the protection you have for those wetlands.
So you'd be supportive of it perhaps in one lot, but not both?
I'll rephrase that a little bit. We'd be supportive of the northwest corner of Lot 1, and if there are portions of Lot 2. So they could have a 10-foot no mow buffer in both lots, just not the entirety of both lots.
So,
How do we approve that?
well, I guess my question maybe is to Jim, if a portion of Lot 2 had the 30-foot and the acceptable 10-foot, would that accommodate the side garage?
You're asking the question of me at this point?
To you, yes.
Please repeat it. So, and I think she meant northeast. I don't think you meant
Yes, I did
northwest a
mean
minute ago.
northeast. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
So if I understand it, you might be receptive on lot 2 to have a combination of 30-foot and something less than 30-foot, right?
Correct. We would, if we did something less than 30 feet, it would have to be a no-mow buffer so that it had the taller vegetation to help protect that wetland. And if I might answer the mayor's question, what we had generally discussed is that we would be supportive of changing the last condition of the staff report to say, to be worked out at a staff level. So we could see some of the floor plans, footprints and such.
So given that, back to Jim, if you had that ability to dictate where that is on lot 2, would that then potentially allow you to have the side access garage?
Well, if it's my understanding that it's all impervious surfaces, it's not just the building, correct?
Okay.
So if a driveway is running up the east side and then swinging into the garage, it would end up being, say, 3/4 of the depth of the lot, anything but the far back southeast corner. So I don't like ambiguity any more than I can tell, we'd like to have some certainty, but it would be substantially the whole lot.
Commissioner Stoker.
Would staff be open to using pavers for a driveway as a permeable surface? Not that I want to wish this upon you, because I'm dealing with them in the city of Mequon, not the best thing, but is that an option? Would that be, help remedy the situation at all? Is that?
It's possible. Pervious surfaces do allow the water to run in versus run off, so it does offer a filtering mechanism, so that would help the wetlands themselves.
So then to you, my question is, do you have a customer and a house designed, or are you still, okay?
No, and the lots will probably be sold. For example, Lakeside is working on a couple of them right now, and they actually had been chatting with engineering staff about this as well. There'll be custom projects, so pretty hard to be telling people what to do on these things.
Mr. Parrish.
Sure, thank you. I was just thinking one solution might be to maybe say a percentage of each lot. So for example, 20% of each lot would have a 10-foot zone, and then the rest of it would be 30 feet.
But if that doesn't do anything for him, what does that do? I mean, if that doesn't get him to where he needs to be, he might as well leave it at 30.
That doesn't get you, if a portion of it is adjusted, you just don't know where your site pad is going to be, so you need the ability to move it around, correct?
Right, but then the driveway in essence would begin at the street. The lot 2, the one that is problematic here, you can see the entire right-hand side is wetland. And then if one adds 30 feet to it, the 30 feet really comes right through the number 2 that you see on that lot, and it renders half of this lot unbuildable. So if we were subdividing it today, for example, we'd reapportion all the lot lines, just put a bigger, buildable place there. These have all been on the tax rolls as improved lots since 2005. And so now we're just trying to somewhat monetize our investment.
Well, I just would interrupt and say that these are still not lots yet. These are just vacant. This is just vacant land. And one solution could be shifting the lot line between 2 and 3 a little bit to make 2 a little bit wider and reduce 3 to give you a little bit more buildable area. I mean, we can play with these lot lines. They're not set in stone at this point.
It's my understanding that the infrastructure for the street storm sewers is chasing those lot lines. We'd have to study that. And that's significant because that's all buried infrastructure. Because the pond itself, when it hits its overflow point, then is conveyed underground, under the road to the north, to the wetland to the north. So there's a pretty significant infrastructure that's already there.
Mr. Stoker?
I don't know what the city's position is on changing side yard setbacks on the non-wetland side. Is that anything that's ever been considered to?
I don't think we really have the authority to do that unless they go through the variance procedure. The wetland setback, we do have some ability to modify, but side yard setback for a building, I think you'd have to go through the variance procedure.
And typically that would be requiring showing a hardship.
Correct. Which becomes difficult because we're just approving these lots now.
Right.
And then coming back in a month saying that there's a hardship when it was somewhat self-created by the creation of the lots.
Yes, sir.
Mike, we've thrown out a variety of options here. Maybe it's best that Jim work with the city. I mean, I don't know if we're gonna solve it here tonight.
Let me just go back to
It
this.
does sound like you each have different information. For example, that staff doesn't know how the lot lines line up with the utilities.
Well, there's an easement, I just pulled it up, and I think this is what I was getting at. Even if you shifted this lot line over a bit, it would be within this easement area. But I guess it really, I mean, all it doesn't help them a ton because the easement and setback kind of line up with one another. So it doesn't really,
Okay.
I go back to my question on the side yard setback again. If they go through the process for a variance, who is that with?
was it go through Board of Appeals?
Okay.
So they would submit a house plan with showing them within the setback area, and then we would deny it because it doesn't meet it, and then they would have to go and ask for a hardship. In the past, we typically have allowed the reduction in the wetland setback with the no-mow buffer.
Right. So with a 10-foot, if you have 100% 10-foot, can you make something work?
I can live with 100% 10-foot, yes. And I have no problem with the requirement, the specific requirements, not just at the 10-foot, but the proper vegetation, et cetera. I'd accept staff's language as to that and then make sure that's recorded along with the documents, the CSM.
So this is where I don't make any friends, but I'll make a motion to approve this with the exception that we're allowing 10-foot, a 10-foot no-mow for all of the buffer zones against the wetlands.
That would be editing condition number 6.
Okay, thank you.
And adding a deed restriction and
Yes.
vegetation as approved by staff, I'm assuming is part of your motion.
So are you referring to both lots or lot 2?
Well, specifically lot 2,
Because lot 1, I believe the setback along this stretch here, we would like to keep
which
at
would probably be
30, which I think would be okay, as well as the setback along this stretch, we would keep at 30, because I don't think that has impact. This is the portion we would change to 10.
Is that correct?
The east side, the extreme east side at 30 is not an issue because one would not put the house there. Hard to see on the drawing, but in the extreme northwest corner, the wetland angles back sharply to the south. And I chased that on CAT a little while ago. You put 30 foot on that and suddenly it's gonna push the house. It's really gonna reduce the width of the house.
well,
But if we have, if we only have 10 foot in the northeast corner, that does help it again. And I'm sorry, I'm calcing it like on the fly here, so.
again, I'll keep my motion where it's 10 foot anywhere, including lot number 1 as well as lot number 2. And I would respectfully ask that if you can make something fit and keep 30 feet, that you do that, or keep it as large as you possibly can.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the Any further discussion based on the motion to approve, subject to staff's recommendations with those changes? If you could call the roll, please.
Commissioner Bach,
Aye.
Commissioner Baca,
Aye.
Commissioner Hawley,
Aye.
Commissioner Chorin,
Aye.
Commissioner Parrish,
No.
Commissioner Stoker,
Aye.
Commissioner Lemke,
Aye.
Mayor Worth.
Aye.
Vote passes 7 to 1.
The next item on the agenda has been canceled, thank you, has been canceled for the evening, or was asked to be withdrawn by the applicant. So the next item we have is a policy discussion along resale shops in the city of Mequon. What's going to happen is staff will make a presentation, then I'll ask the couple of people who have registered to speak, and then we'll bring it to the commission for discussion.
So a little bit of a background. Recently, we've had a couple of different inquiries come forward with regard to the sale of used goods. One is involving the operators of Ecollectique, which buys, sells, and trades high-end clothing and accessories. They recently purchased the Gigi's building at 1550 West Mequon Road. That parcel is Zone B2 community commercial, which allows retail trade as a permitted use. The other request comes from Ivana's Trunk, which is currently located at 10448. They are Zone B4. Retail trade is not permitted in the B4 zoning district. We had have put them on notice that pending what the outcome of this discussion is, if it's not successful on their behalf, they would have to vacate the premises because they're not legally approved operations at that site. So instead of the commission having received two separate individual text amendment requests, we figured we'd talk to this as a policy issue, get your input, and then if need be, we would come back with some language changes to our code to address either one or both of these issues. The rationale for the denial for the accessories is basically our definition in our zoning code for retail trade, which involves the selling of new goods. It is somewhat unique, I think, in Mequon versus other communities that we actually specify new goods as a sale. And then we do allow used goods, but it has to be accessory to the new goods sales. We do ban the sale of, or basically a pawn shop where money is loaned on secured personal items as part of that definition. There are a couple distinctions in the city where we do allow some sort of sale as a primary use. This is typically with antiques and collectibles. The town center and arrival corridor district allows antiques and collectibles as a permitted use. And then the LTD zoning overlay allows antique sales as a conditional use. So I just have some information in here about, what we can do going forward in terms of process and how we want to handle that. I think I did put a lot of information. Used clothing sales is not necessarily my forte, so I did put some information in there from a couple different sources that really show the market is actually changing out there with regard to how these businesses are operating. You see the real stores are opening up across the country, which is typically an online retailer. You also see other stores that are traditional brick and mortar stores like TJ Maxx and others looking at actually adding resale as part of their operations because they see this threat coming from these other online sellers. So you've seen a definite change. It's not necessarily the old view of resale where it's usually our lower end product in an area that may not attract the level of rents that a community like Mequon would usually see. These are a lot of upscale shops, a lot of areas that are thriving, and they actually do fairly well. Brookfield, City of Brookfield has a number of them. There's other communities that also have them. I did put some information in your packet, which I'll talk a little bit about later, about how they're regulated across the state as well as the country. So it is something that I think we're going to see more of, so I think we need to address it, be proactive and address this instead of being reactive and allowing these to come forward and kind of discussing them on a case-by-case basis. So in terms of options, I just kind of laid out a couple things we could do. One of them would be to leave it as is and not allow them. I think we're missing, again, a little part of the market then. I think we're going to maybe, in some of our retail areas, I think these would be very attractive uses for the residents of the community, especially some of the high-end clothing stores that are out there. So if we are looking to make a change, we we kind of just segregated the uses a little bit. I mean, I think used clothing has a little bit of different niche than like the used merchandise and furniture sales. The used clothing we felt would go more in like our retail areas, the B1, the B2, neighborhood commercial, or the LTD districts, whereas the sale of furniture, household items, those would maybe be better in the B4 or B5 where you have maybe a little bit larger footprint of a shop. So we can look at how you guys want to handle going forward with those, but we kind of saw a segregation between those different types of uses, even though they are both used. We did put some recommendations going forward, how we could handle some of these issues. And the first ones I just talked about is just adding a definition to our zoning code to address some of these issues. We don't have a definition of antique store in our code. I did a search from other communities and it ranges from anywhere from 20 years to 100 years in terms of what an antique is. So I think we need to kind of come up with a definition for that. Other ones talk about having been recognized by a formal organization as being an antique, some sort of appraisal or something like that, that would require it to be labeled as an antique before it could be sold. And then some do allow a certain percentage of floor space to be allocated to non-antique items as part of that operation. I think we also talk about having a definition for a resale clothing store as well as resale merchandise. And we put in some conditions that we think would help kind of alleviate some of the concern of maybe having a lower end product at some of these shops. So they're pretty similar on in both of the definitions, but I'll just kind of go through them quickly. We put in there they should be purchased or on consignment only. No donations should be allowed. Stores should be limited to one type of merchandise, whether if it's clothing or household. We wouldn't want to see a mix of the two. Limit the size of the space of the shops. For like the retail clothing, we're thinking maybe 2,500 would be appropriate for a limit. And then for the furniture and household items, maybe up to 5,000 square feet as a maximum. Prohibit any outdoor display of items. I know that's been a complaint in the past with the Ivana's location here, and when it was previously in the town center area. And then having maybe a minimum value of trade or consignment to make sure that the goods are a little bit higher end. That becomes a little bit more difficult and very difficult for us to enforce, but these are items we could address as part of this whole zoning change. And then finally, having specific exterior or interior architectural standards of the buildings where they're going to make sure that these are still high-end retail or high-end shops that we're allowing them to open in the city. Basically the same definitions for architectural salvage and for the furniture as well. Another option we have to regulate them beyond the zoning code is licensing. We currently have a licensing requirement for secondhand goods, which I did put in your code. So if there's requirements that we feel that we want to have, but maybe not appropriate in a zoning district, like how many we will allow or how many we allow in a certain area, that would probably be more appropriate in the licensing requirements versus in the zoning code. So those are some of the things that we thought would be a good way to protect the city while allow these uses to come forward. Again, looking at other communities, I put a whole list in there from APA that gave me a number of communities all across the country and how they regulate them. Again, a lot of them look at the years of sales. I believe it was Pompano Beach that's segregated that you had to either do clothing or you had to do furniture. You couldn't do both. Locally, Grafton, I spoke with the planner there. They require a conditional use in certain zoning districts, but in certain zoning districts it is permitted. Port Washington allows resale as a permitted use. They don't define new versus used in terms of a sale. And the same with Cedarburg. They typically allow antiques and collectibles in certain zones, typically along their Main Street corridor. So, staff feels that with protections put in place, we can further refine the requirements to allow these uses in the city without having a negative impact on our commercial district overall. So we're basically looking for your feedback on what direction you'd like us to take going forward. And I believe both of the affected applicants are also here as well to kind of make their pitch to the commission on why these are good uses for the community. Thank you.
Thank you. We have two people, two sheets of people signed up. One has multiple people. Our typical rule is 5 minutes. And also this isn't about specific applications. It's about a policy for the city. So I hope we can gear our comments towards that rather than about individual stores. The first person who turned in a sheet was Alderman Mark Girl, who supports Not sure what he supports, but he says he wishes to speak since we don't have anything specifically in front of us.
Thank you. My name is Mark Garrell, and I do support resale shops in Mequon. I think they're quite a benefit to the community for a number of reasons. And Mequon is an affluent community, and Mequon is an aging community. And if you've noticed recently, products or furniture at my house turns over, antiques at my house turn over, and I would typically just call up Purple Heart, or I'd call up St. Vincent de Paul, or I'd call up Salvation Army, and they come and pick them up. Actually, with today's economy and the way things are going, they don't even pick them up. They don't even return the call. They have too much stuff. Now, I've shopped at resale shops across the country, and they have beautiful retail shops in Carmel, California, and they have beautiful retail shops in Cedarburg. And I think that looking at demographics, I think that we're going to see there's absolutely a need, and it provides a service to the community. It's a place where people can go to, instead of throw out their good things and that have some value. They can get $1 for them. They don't have to put them on eBay. They don't have to learn the internet. Just bring them in, and somebody else finds that, and they can take advantage of it. So I do support these in Mequon. I'd like to see a thoughtful way to go about it, and maybe like Cedarburg, you could get a row of, if you can find an area where you can have one resale shop at another, so people can just walk and go from one to the other. But I think the Planning Commission can come up with something, and I'd like to see us go forward with this, and I support it wholeheartedly. So, thank you.
The next sheet is from Mikkel Flanner, Rebecca Lasky, and Rodney Carter, representing Eclectique, and they wish to speak.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rod Carter. I'm with Hush Blackwell in Milwaukee. I'm an attorney, and I have representatives with me from Eclectique who will introduce themselves to you as well. I'm not going to belabor what I want to say tonight because we agree with staff and the report that they gave you. I think that this is something that Mequon should do. As a former plan commissioner in the city of Brookfield and present Board of Appeals member in the city of Brookfield, I can tell you, I know we aren't supposed to speak to particular businesses, but the city would welcome a business, the city of Brookfield would welcome a business like Eclectique. I think they offer something that is unique. And more importantly, I think that this whole resale concept is part of the new trend that we're seeing. Everything's changing, it seems, all the time. And retail certainly is changing. And I don't have to tell you just how. From the news that we're reading, everything from Sears to everything else that's going on and shifting. So I think that this addresses a current trend, and I think that with the proper standards in place, which the city can and is looking at now, implementing, that you can do this the right way and bring a benefit to the city. So I'll turn it over to my clients for anything they have to say.
One point, I know that there's been discussion.
Can you pull the microphone a little bit closer to you, please?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mikkel Flanner. I am the owner of Eclectique and Wisconsin Commercial Properties, which did buy the building at 150 to 150, the old Gigi's building. And I'm available if anyone has any questions regarding any aspect of the business. I would like to just state that I think that what the city has done so far in regards, the staff in regards to the proposal is so on track for what market trends are. One thing that I just would like to provide is some feedback for if you are considering maybe distinguishing between the furniture aspect or household goods aspect, is that considering anything wearable goods as a separate entity, because we do deal in, at least my particular business does deal in clothing, accessories, and jewelry, and I just would want to make sure that like jewelry wasn't excluded from clothing, and that it wasn't just a clothing. But what basically I'm looking to create at this complex too is an entire experience, very much like the building that's across the street where there is a salon and a cafe and many shopping outlets held. We would be offering a cafe in this complex. We would be offering a plastic surgeon, and then you would have an opportunity to bring in merchandise to have them serviced. You could have handbags refurbished or shoes refurbished, as well as what then going shopping in elevated resale experience. So it would be an entire destination at this particular complex, which is what my store would bring. And I encourage anybody to visit the Thiensville complex that Eclectique currently runs to just see the quality and that we do put into our resale experience. And we are looking to do that even better in Mequon. And again, I'm available if there are any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Flanner. Did anyone else wish to speak? I know that our former August City Council is here, and his client who is interested in the other end of the spectrum.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I hadn't actually necessarily anticipated speaking this evening. I recently suffered a torn retina in my left eye, and I'm still, I think, half blind as a result of that, although it's clearing up a bit. But in any event, I have been working with Victoria Gerard, who is the owner of Ivana's Trunk. And in that regard, I've been talking with staff about her circumstances, and that's something of a unique position because the building that she is in is, although it's in this retail corridor, the entryway or Port Washington Road type corridor, she's in a building which is zone B4, which is, I think, somewhat unusual for that corridor. Normally, we would see that in the industrial park, the business park. And in fact, B4 is Business Park District. But the fact is, she's in an old factory or warehouse type building there. And it's actually fortuitous, I guess, for her that she is, because she needs a considerable amount of square footage. I'm sure 5,000 would certainly not be too much for someone operating a business like hers. Hers, I think, may be slightly more than that. But in any event, looking at the B4 district, we had some ideas that we've shared with staff and talked to staff about a text amendment to the ordinance. And I've drafted what I think might be language, at least as a starting place to look at in that regard, and shared that with staff. And of course, in my client's shop, she's not primarily or even significantly concerned with clothing or apparel. She's more into high-end older furniture and objects of art, antiques, or pieces which I've tried to characterize in this draft ordinance that I've shared. Decorative and collectible pieces associated with a historical time period or an event or a period in time reflective of a particular fashion or decorative sensibility, such that the items held for retail may be considered artistically, culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, but not including articles reasonably considered to be rummage or pawn shops. Certainly we've excluded that. So, but that's the type of stock in trade that she deals in. And I think if you've ever been to shops that have architectural salvage or decorative artifacts, they're quite fascinating places, and some of them have some amazing things. You may recall from the news recently, the Milwaukee County Executive tore down a historic mansion on Lake Drive, and prior to doing so, had salvage and reclamation people come in to take out woodwork and mantles and fixtures and all kinds of things that would be associated with the time period of that house. And those things will undoubtedly end up in an operation not dissimilar to that run by my client. So I'd certainly be happy for staff to share my thoughts with you with regard to my draft.
It's in the package, John.
Okay,
think it
great.
is in the
Yeah.
packet.
All right. I don't know if there's any questions, but I'd be happy to attempt to answer them, even though I can barely see you all.
Not right now, but we will, we'll get back to you if we have some.
All right. Thank you very much.
I believe that's everybody registered to speak. So I guess it comes to us. I think the first, Mequon has prohibited these uses historically, in large part not necessarily to keep those uses out, but to make sure that lower end junkier places don't propagate themselves. Make sure that we don't have places like Goodwill and Restore. You know, Goodwill would love to take over the building that Avantis Trunk is currently in. I'm not saying we shouldn't accommodate this, but I think we need to be careful because while Alderman Gurl, what I don't want it to be is a replacement for having stuff hauled off to Purple Heart. I was a little surprised at those comments, but I could see that having nice antique type places and nice higher end boutique type places wouldn't necessarily, assuming we can craft something that makes that actually work, wouldn't necessarily be, in my opinion, terrible. But other comments? Alderman, Mr. Bach.
But first, thanks for that article too in there. I mean, it's kind of nice to see the Plan Commission get involved in fashion and design, right? All the trends. But I certainly, after reading all that, support kind of appropriate boutique resale shops in the city. And along with that, support a zoning definition that gives the city the most control. So those two things, I like the sustainability part of the resale shop. Place where I work, we have a fundraiser every year that has about 30 boutique shops that come from around the country, and they sell them in the gymnasiums. And even there's 2 or 3 every year that now have kind of high-end resale clothing. So I support it. I had a couple questions that I just wanted to ask. One, in the zoning list, there was something in it that said NC zoning. I didn't know what that was. I couldn't find that on my cheat sheet.
Sure, it's neighborhood commercial. That's a newer zoning district that we created as part of the moratorium around the Cedarburg Road Donjas Bay intersection. There's only a handful of properties in that area that are neighborhood commercial. That's what it stands for. So when you look at the old Alpine Village site, the old Taylor and Dunn's, that area there's a number of parcels zoned neighborhood commercial.
Okay, so that's good. And then I suppose that these estate sales where having single kind of items would take that group out, where you have like people who come in and do estate sales and then bring all those items over to a shop to sell, and you'd have to figure out.
Well, that was the way they would have to sell them at that point. They couldn't just donate what's ever left.
They couldn't bring it to a store.
Right.
Then, yeah. Okay, those are my questions.
Mr. Baca.
Yeah, who would make the decision with respect to what is high-end?
Well, and that's where Attorney DeStefanis had a conversation about his ordinance, and I said it's rather subjective. So I don't know if we can really get down to that level of calling it high-end versus low-end. I think what we were trying to do with some of the regulations here is to protect us as much as possible in terms of the conditions that we added. And we can take it to a number of different levels. I mean, the most restrictive we could be in terms of allowing it would be through like the LTD zoning district, which is an overlay zone. That only is, I think there's two properties in Mequon that currently have that overlay zone. One is Lexington Square, and then there's another one off of West Mequon Road. If we required it to be an overlay, then basically majority of the cases that would come in front of you would be a zoning change, and then we have the authority through that zoning change to add as many conditions as we want and vet them, and we could deny them without, having to provide findings like a typical conditional use would. So that would be the most restrictive way we can look at them. We could do conditional use, we could do permitted use if we have a comfortable list of conditions we're okay with. And then the other issue, again, is licensing. That's a different issue, and I think we can have more restrictive requirements through the licensing that, again, that aren't necessarily something you'd see in a zoning district. But to say what's high end or low end, that becomes a really difficult thing to quantify.
Is that, where are you going with number 5, minimum value of trade-in or consignment?
Well, again, that's where if you were bringing in an item, that it had to have a certain level of value so that you didn't bring in something that you were getting $5 for, and then they were turning around and selling it for 20. Again, that's a very difficult thing, and then maybe that's something that would be in a license versus a zoning district, but that was a way to make sure that the items in the store had at least some value. Clothing, that's probably a lot more difficult, but for the furniture, that you could, set a minimum value of X, or again, these are suggestions. We don't have to follow these, but these are just different things that I saw out there in terms of how they were being enforced around the city or the state and the country.
Instead of minimum trade-in or consignment, could you just make minimum sale price? I mean, nothing for sale under, in a resale shop, under a certain amount, certain dollar figure, to keep the very low-end stuff out?
I mean, you can do that. Again, it's difficult to enforce, and it's, something that I think would probably be better suited in the license versus in the zoning district.
Here's one of the difficulties of that. If you've been to these shops, they tend to change pricing. I'm not saying either one of these in particular, but they tend to change pricing based on how long something's been on the floor.
Right.
It might have come in and been a $1,000 item, but if it sticks around for 6 months, it might be down to $200 because they want to move it. Even if they're going to take a loss, it's better than having
It's
something
hard to
that doesn't
define.
sell.
I mean, I had a friend who ran Walter's Loft in Cedarburg, very high-end furniture consignment. You walked in and you thought you were in a new furniture showroom. That's how it was set up. It wasn't a bunch of stuff piled in the corner. But how you define that compared to something that gets into that more rummage stuff, that's very difficult.
Mr. Parrish.
Sure. Thought this was a really good process with going with the text amendment instead of case by case for each of these businesses. I also thought the staff had a very good write-up to help educate us on the topic, so thank you for that. The subcommittee recently did a vacancy rate study and use study along Port Washington Road, and retail and office, of course, scored relatively high vacancy, in each case above 10%, and in some cases up to 15%. So I was kind of looking at it from a macro view in this particular case, and I think we should definitely be open to alternative uses. Still concerned about the pavilions and, what is going to happen when some of those big box retailers eventually leave. And I think these owners are going to be desperate to bring in anyone. So we need to ask ourselves, do we want Dollar Trees and big lots? Or do we want local businesses that have character and provide a service to our residents? And I guarantee you that is coming down the road here. So I think we need to be proactive and create alternative uses. Mayor Dan always used to talk about kids' entertainment places in these retails. I think that's a great use, these alternative uses. What I don't want is really low-end retailers. So I guess I'm in supportive of it, especially the local aspect of it is really important. The yellow building has been discussed a little bit, and if that's going to be retail, it should be retail. I mean, it doesn't look retail right now. I also think that any business in the city of Mequon should be required to get an occupancy permit. There's never an exception when you can just move into a building, and it kind of creates a lawless situation. But I do commend this process and totally supportive of the actual businesses. So I hope it all works out.
Other general comments, and then maybe I'll turn it to staff to talk about how we should specifically walk through this. Anybody? All right.
Well, I guess I would just ask if there's anything that you find in the report in terms of the different approaches as being either not strict enough or too strict. Again, we can look at it from a couple different angles. The LTD district would be probably our most strict approach in terms of, but that's going to require a zoning change for almost each individual request, which is basically a 3-month process, goes through common council. So while it is, it gives us the most protection, it's also probably the most lengthy procedure. You can do it as a conditional use in certain zoning districts, and we can place conditions on them. I'm not sure, other than if we have a significant list already in the code, what other conditions we would add to that. So I'm not sure if that's the path we want to go down. Or we could just make it permitted in certain zoning districts. Again, I think we feel the retail portion of it with the clothing should be more in the B1, B2 areas, and then the household goods, B5. B4 it's that the yellow building, as we call it, is a little bit difficult. It is zone B4, which is kind of, it's not a business park, obviously. It was zone B4 for a long period of time. Probably should have been B5 from what was in there previously. I'm not sure the history of it, but it is B4. And if you look at the definition, I'd be a little concerned about allowing that type of use in a business park setting. But we don't have a lot of B4 zoning other than our business park on the Corporate Parkway, which my guess is they probably have some restrictions on that in their covenants already. So that's the only thing I'd be a little concerned about, is manipulating the code to make Ivana's fit into that puzzle a little bit. I'd prefer to look at it from what's best for the community, and then if it works for that particular use there, great. If it doesn't, then we'd have to look at different options for them going forward. So I'm just looking for feedback if you're okay with this direction, or if you want to see something else. And then we can come back with a specific ordinance addressing both of the uses, or neither, or just one.
Alderman Urban.
I guess I see some value in pursuing these types of alternative uses, but I think we should be cautious. So I'd be supportive of taking the approach of the limited district. Just noting that this would be new for Mequon to give us the maximum amount of control. But say we do that, a business goes in, it all gets approved, there's a number of conditions. What is our clawback provision or recourse if it ends up going south later? I just would like to hear staff's perspective on that.
Well, the LTD, if we do it as an overlay and we approve a specific use, and we'll have numerous conditions with that use, if they violate those conditions, then we'd have enforcement against them. If they go out of business, any new business would have to fit those exact parameters again, or they would have to do another use within that district. So I think that, again, that gives us the most protection, because we'll have a specific list of conditions. Now, there could be a situation where you had a high-end one that we approved and everything was great, and then went out of business, and then something came in maybe at a different quality level. But if we have enough conditions in place, we could protect that as best as we can. I mean, I don't think it's going to be foolproof, but I think we can at least eliminate some of the concerns over, lower end quality merchandise.
Well, I'm going to take a different position. I don't like the LTD district. I don't like putting an applicant through the process of having to seek rezoning. If we're going to allow something, we ought to allow it. We just ought to be very clear what the restrictions are. I think if our community gets a bad rap for businesses and development, it's that it's a moving target and nobody knows what the requirements are going in. And I think we see that whenever we're doing rezonings. I'd much rather have us be thoughtful and impose appropriate conditions. And then, we can always change the policy if we don't like the policy or if we're over restrictive. But simply making it an LTD kicks the can down the road from, we don't want to quite do our job now in doing the planning, we'll do it when an applicant comes and then put everybody through the ringer each time. I don't think that's a good way to conduct business. But I think, a couple of the categories that you mentioned, I agree with that, no donation. The first several you have on your list of 6. I don't know about number 5. I think that is a difficult one to police, and I don't think we should set up unrealistic expectations. We're not going to have an inspector who looks at this. And value maybe, I don't know, but maybe it's something, if you all of a sudden you see a junk shop and you go in and everything is, 99-cent stuff, you have a hammer. So maybe that's not so bad. I like number 6, but I think it's the one, and when we've talked, the one that's least fleshed out. If you insist on fairly nice spaces, you're going to get nicer stores. If you have places that are, I think the resale shop areas that you see junk being sold in also tend to be rundown spaces in rundown buildings, and both on the inside and outside, because the rent's cheap and they're not gonna put any money into having an attractive space. The question is, and maybe an architect can help us with this, what kind of restrictions we potentially could, what we could have as far as the criteria. Because I do think that would make a difference in what we attract and what we have. And I think, Cedarburg's different. Cedarburg has a quaint area of older buildings that, first of all, are generally architecturally interesting to begin with, as opposed to most of our retail buildings. And they're all fairly limited size. So, it's a different kind of an investment than somebody who signs a short-term lease, walks in with a bunch of stuff and tries to sell it. We don't have an area like Cedarburg where you've got nice old, 1800s buildings. So to make it work, and we also have some very nice retail space. I'm not saying we want to make it too haughty. I also don't want to see this just being an alternative for dollar stores, because I think there are places you can drive around and find retail shops that you'd almost rather have a dollar store from an impact on a community. So that's the challenge, I guess I see, is what can you add to make it fair to the applicants, not make them have to go through a rezoning process every time, but at the same time have enough restrictions that you are fairly likely to have decent space. Mr. Baca?
Yeah, I think the question is, all of your alternatives, does it require that the applicant be approved by the commission?
Again, if it's a conditional use or if it's a zoning change, then yes. If it's a permitted use, the condition of the architecture design elements, that could be in front of the commission. But if it's without that condition, the rest of it would be basically a staff level approval if it's permitted in the district.
Okay, but there would be an approval.
There would have to be an approval, yes. We have a business occupancy permit. We'd have to make sure they go through the process. And there is also still that licensing issue. Again, some of this could be handled with the licensing, the question about value and all that. I mean, some communities I've seen, they license these every year, and you could ask them to submit, detailed financial information as part of that to make sure they're meeting the requirements that we put in place from a value aspect of it. Because, we don't have a zoning inspector going out and doing that would be very difficult. But so there would be some level of authority on our end to make sure that they're complying with whatever requirement we come up with.
But it's even planning commissions historically have been rather subjective in picking and choosing on conditional uses. The state Supreme Court has changed that. So the use itself, licensing, again, there may be an application process, but it's not going to be unless we put in the application process that you have to, I don't know what the criteria is, but you have to have the criteria. It can't be subjective. Now, that is the one advantage of the LTD. Alderman Urban.
That was precisely my thinking with the limited LDD district is with the state of Wisconsin's recent ruling on conditional uses, it's almost makes it very comparable to a permitted use. And I don't know that, I agree we should, in a perfect world, we should do our homework and get the wording perfect. But I'm still not sure we could fully define it in every case possible. Maybe a more expedient way would be to allow it through limited district zoning while we figure it all out. I just see a protracted process trying to get it so perfect that it's everything we ever want it to be, that nothing happens for several months and leaves these businesses in limbo too. That could just as well equally play out.
But you will probably, if conditional use, if the decisions regarding conditional uses have gotten to where they are, I can't imagine it's far beyond where the state Supreme Court is going to say, no, you really can't just pick and choose. If you're going to allow it, you're going to allow it, and if you're not going to allow it. And to make totally subjective determinations basically on the same basis that the totally subjective determinations were made previously for conditional uses, they're not going to buy into that. I think that that's on pretty shaky legal ground also. You still need to have good criteria and then determine individual locations where you'll overlay that, but not based on who the person is and not based on coming up with new criteria. I think that that's as shaky as the conditional use process. Mr. Parrish.
I'll be quick. I agree. I like the control and the rezone. However, just to bring up the subcommittee again, we're looking at zoning along all of Port Washington Road and highest and best uses in various places. So I would just be concerned about, I kind of like the conditional use just being for, kind of like one time each user versus getting into the practice of having inconsistent zoning along Port Washington Road when we're really trying to get our arms around it and have efficient developments and so on. So I'd like the idea of being able to put a lot of conditions on it. And I do like the licensing idea that Jack brought up, so.
Yeah, that's what I think if we can do something through licensing and through conditional use, that makes sense. I think if you're asking a small business owner who wants to we want a local person to come in here and open a store, and then you say, by the way, it has to get rezoned, that's 3 months, that's 4 times you gotta come sit here. I think they're gonna go to Cedarburg or somewhere else. I think that's too much. So, but I'd like to see some control. Maybe it can be done through licensing to try to keep the stores out that we don't want here.
So a hybrid approach, you think, without the rezoning would be the most appropriate path? Because we can try to bring something back, craft something like a hybrid approach through licensing and through zoning, if you'd like to see it that way.
Mr. Chorn, what do you think about the ability to impose some sort of architectural standards or layout standards, or is my thought misplaced?
Well, I think you've referenced Cedarburg where, you have these old buildings that suit bringing, old items together for sale. I mean, it's a perfect fit, and you don't have that in Mequon. I'm struggling with trying to drive the architecture of the building to match the items that are for sale inside. I think they're two different things. I mean, it's just, Cedarburg's just lucky that they got things that can mesh, the architecture of the building and the items that they're selling, and I don't see that being available here. I don't think you can force somebody to modify the architecture of the building to match what they intend to sell inside.
Yeah, lots of retailers do that. I mean, when they're planning it.
Right. Now, there's a difference between somebody creating something new, a new building to reflect what the merchandise they're selling versus somebody moving into an existing building and requiring them to modify the architecture of the building to match their product.
I was just thinking that the TIs that are likely to be done anyhow to have some sort of standard. I would think that I don't care how Marshall's, if you're going to take the build out of the type that Marshall's has, and I don't care if you're putting either the clothing store stuff or the furniture stuff in there, it's going to look like a dollar store. Big, wide open, white drywall.
So am I understanding that you're looking towards potentially wanting the tenant to modify the tenant improvements to match rather than the exterior architecture?
Right, that's what I'm thinking,
Okay.
the TIs.
That would,
Well, I think we can do some of that just with scale on the size, obviously, because Marshall's going to be larger than the 2,500 or 5,000, so that the size, the limitation on size will help that issue somewhat, but I think we're still going to run into some subjectiveness on what that interior space looks like and how to define it, because I'm not sure how we do that. That's the hard part.
and does the city have the wherewithal or the ability to dictate the tenant improvements?
Well, we review floor plans as part of any remodel. We have that ability to do so now. We typically look at things like covering up the windows. We don't really get too involved into their interior space as long as it complies with building code.
Right.
But we have that authority through the floor plan to regulate what that could look like.
But primarily you look at, sanitary fixtures, exit.
Egress,
exits,
yes,
and
yeah.
those type of things. You don't look into the
Type of carpeting or the,
the way to display product. So,
right.
My concern using architectural, particularly exterior architectural features, which I like where we're going, but I think realistically, knowing the city and knowing this planning commission, you're gonna have people up here 2 times or 3 times potentially anyway, trying to, they're gonna present something, or they're gonna come in for a commentary from us to see what they think we will allow them to do. Then they're gonna be back again anyway. You're gonna be talking 2 or 3 months anyway. To me, I think the LTD is the way to move forward. I'm all about not making a prolonged process out of something, but I just don't know that we're not gonna have a 2 or 3 month process anyway. If someone says, I'm trying to change the front of this building to look like this for this type of sale.
Well, I was talking about interior, but anyhow.
Totally, okay.
Because you're not gonna change a building for a 2,500 square foot tenant.
Exactly,
Even if you look at the 2 buildings that are before us, one is
Right.
very attractive, one is gigantic, and they're not gonna be able to do anything with it. And so therefore, I'm not sure you can even enter into that discussion. But I think just like cities look at exterior architecture, there's nothing legally that precludes them from looking at interior architecture.
I think it's interesting.
I'm not
though,
sure I
here-
want to go very far on that
just
other than
in a
this
typical
use.
remodel, you're not really looking, like you said, you're looking at windows. That's what we've historically done.
Yes, for the most part.
It's almost you need to have an architect be involved in that process then. I don't know. It's a very interesting conversation. It's a tough, there's no easy solution to this.
Yes. Well, that's why we brought it in front of you.
Yep.
So, we can work, again, as long as there's general consensus that we want to move forward with something, and there still seems to be a debate on maybe which path, we could provide you a couple different options next time, or maybe just 2 options, one through the LTD process and how that would work with or one with like a hybrid license issue with conditional use. We can try that and bring it back to you and see if we go from there.
Can I ask we don't really have the whole licensing concept, it would be something new to the city. Would that be handled at your level, or?
No, that's through the clerk's office. We do have, the code does require licensing. It'd be treated just like we have other uses here that require a license as well.
I'm envisioning something a little more complicated than a dog license.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have liquor license, those go through a process, through a committee, and this would be, on par with something like that.
Okay.
But I would hope that, I would envision that the license, the approval to use, for use would be would be able to be structured as a one-stop, one meeting, unless there was a problem.
Yeah. I think the more requirements we have up front, and then they can show they can comply with them, then it's pretty a straightforward process then.
But some kind of annual license.
Yeah, that's typically what I've seen. They have to renew them on an annual basis.
That way you protect yourself a little bit if this started as a high-end store
Right.
and now it's a junk store, we
Yeah.
can.
And we do liquor inspections on an annual basis on bars and restaurants to make sure that everything is still compliant and things like that.
Anything else on this item? Thank you very much. Our next item is the text amendment to chapters 2 of the ordinances regarding the establishment and operation of this body. If I might, since I wrote it, the memo that came along with it is, well, there's two memos. The impetus behind doing it was, in fact, to establish some sort of reconsideration process. It turns out our ordinances allow a motion to reconsider from the planning, at the common council level, but not at the planning commission. And this was to make it fairly parallel, so that if somebody came to realize that they regretted their vote, that there was an opportunity to bring a motion to reconsider. It also, our ordinances are not clear with respect to somebody loses a vote, can they simply reapply and come back the next month? Probably by practice they can't, but this sets up some similar guidelines to what has to happen at the same with the common council. In looking at that, I found out two other things that need to be changed. One, the current ordinance, if you remember 2 years ago, we went through a process of redoing all of our boards and commissions. Every single one of our committees, we restructured how the ordinances were laid out, simplified the language. That was more at the common council level. But at the time, we were going to get rid of, well, no, there was a proposal. I'm not sure I wouldn't want to say we were going to, but there was a proposal to merge the tree board, the open space board, and the parks commission. And it was going to be called the Natural Resources Board. The ordinance that was passed has the term Natural Resources Board in it, even though we don't have such a thing. So this corrects that to make it the Park and Open Space Board. And the third thing that's in here is the Public Welfare Committee is working on an ordinance change that would allow citizen volunteers to appear at some meetings by telephone as opposed to having to be there. There's all sorts of restrictions on it. In every draft, this body, you can't appear by telephone. And this is simply adding that language into the ordinance. Here where it should be, rather than they were kind of shoehorning it into something else. So that's the three purposes behind this text amendment. The only real substantive one is this whole issue of a motion to reconsider and also a time limit on when you can come back to the planning commission. So that would be essentially numbers 1 and 2 on the draft ordinance. So we thought that it ought to come to this body to have a discussion on whether we want that clarified, whether we want that authority, or whether it's good. Lack of clarity is a good thing. So hope you don't mind I jumped in and did your presentation. So that's what's before us. Any questions? discussion, or a motion to recommend approval?
I will certainly make the motion for recommendation for approval.
Is there a second? Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it, and one last motion would be, our next meeting is
November 11th.
11th at 6 p.m. So there's one other thing that's in order.
Motion to adjourn.
We have the motion and a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.